I returned to the scene of the Hiram derailment on April the 17th of 2022. Some 5 months had passed since the time of the original derailment, and at first, not a lot seemed like it was getting done or touched or cleaned up. About the only thing that had gotten done for a long time was the original lead locomotive that had laid over on its side during the initial crash had been picked up and uprighted and laid next to the other two locomotives that were still left sitting on the ground. And the tanker cars that were in the ditch behind the locomotives had been drained by the railroad, but nothing had really been started to be cleaned up. I heard recently that work had begun on cleaning up the derailment, so I went out to investigate and see what had been done and to kind of take a last minute look at this crash scene before it was fully cleaned up. I arrived to find that the three locomotives had been picked up off the ground and placed onto three flat cars that are now sitting on the siding. And as we can look at them, we start to see the amount of damage that was done to each locomotive. Number 9759 had some structural damage to the driver's side cab. Number 3629 had the rear rail guards on the rear side of the locomotive damaged as well. Number 3629 also had some structural damage to the coolers fans on the right side, along with a couple of the panel doors that had been knocked loose from their foundation, and the flooring of the walking deck had also been damaged. Number 9759 suffered some fireman side cab damage to the window as well as the sun visor over the window as well. The number 8133, which also originally landed on its side in a crash, is now uprighted and has the paint is beginning to rust on it from where it was scraped in the gravel during the initial part of the crash. And the railing on that crash side is also pretty well beat up, as well as the rear cooling fan also is pretty well beat up. And as we can see in this shot here, the rail, the siding that the locomotives are now sitting on, is also still not connected to the main line. So that switch is going to have to be reinstalled and put back in place, which now we know the switch is indeed what caused the original derailment to take place. It was apparently out of alignment with the main line, and the train came along and hit that switch when it was out of alignment and derailed. And one thing we can see off in the distance past this switch is this railroad electrical junction box of some sort that took a big beating during the crash and derailment. And it's amazing that this structure is still damaged like this. Apparently, whatever it was wasn't too vital to the railroad here, because the crossing arms still function as they're supposed to in Hiram, and trains still come through here every day along this busy stretch of rail, and yet nothing's been done, to replace or restore this damaged electrical box. Moving on to the tanker cars that are laying around in the ditch back behind the locomotives, they have mostly remained untouched. They have been drained. Sometime immediately after the initial derailment, they were drained and dated to say that they've been drained and cleaned on the inside. And since then, crews have been cutting up different fragments of metal like railing and the wheels off the cars and whatnot, piling them up in piles. And they're using this big giant excavator with this big giant claw to try and shear and move some of this metal. And they're also using these tanks of oxygen and acetylene here to cut up all the scrap iron. The initial lift of these locomotives was done by these two crawlers here that are stationed here next to the site, and were used to lift these locomotives and probably to place this rail car on the siding from the main line. So here's another interesting thing that I found while exploring the Hiram siding is this section of rail that's stamped from 1946. And we can see here in this picture that the rail up here is extremely well worn and is burring off in little fragments of pieces of metal. But this is actually on the outside of the rail, which is not the side that the flange of the wheel would actually ride against. And if we look at this picture here, we can actually see that this section of rail is a lot narrower than the other rails it is connected to, which are newer. They're 1995 model rails. And that is probably due to the severe wear that's on this section of rail. And it's just interesting that this section of rail has been, kind of reused and repurposed in this siding here. Probably done, way back when they were, whatever construction crews in 1995 were putting this together, realized that, they were missing a section of rail and just repurpose what they had to make it work. But this is the real reason why I was here. During my original recording of my original video on the derailment of the train that took place in Hiram, Georgia, in November of 2021, I realized during the recording of that video that I saw this section on the overhead satellite imagery of the crash scene here in Hiram of this what looked to be an abandoned railroad bed. And having lived in this area for the past 32 years, I thought I kind of knew most of everything about the railroad history in this area, at least in modern times. And this abandoned railroad bed, I never realized even existed until the making of that video. And I was like, what is that? So this is what I had for months now wanted to come and explore and try and figure out what this was or what this is. And I wasn't able to do so because the abandoned railroad bed here is located just behind where all the railroad cars sit in this ditch, blocking access to this railroad bed. And so I didn't want to really trespass too much on the derailment scene and disturb anything or be where I shouldn't be. But at the same time, I really wanted to get this done. So while I was here exploring what was left of the derailment, I went ahead and looked to see what the access was to getting to this abandoned railroad bed, and it decided that it would be okay for me to go ahead and make my way over there and check it out. So I did. And as I went down this abandoned railroad bed, more and more it began to be able to be seen that this was indeed an abandoned railroad bed. First of all, I found a whole bunch of gravel and rock underneath the grass that had overgrown it, kind of symbolizing that this, was indeed a railroad bed. And then later, I found some bolts and other metal debris scattered around that kind of, gave the conclusion that this is indeed part of what used to be a railroad bed, as well as a lump of coal. I also found what appears to be part of a frisbee or a plate or something like that, something made of plastic that's round like this. And stamped on that structure is a copyright date of 1966. I also found a creek that goes underneath this railroad bed. And as we explore this abandoned railroad bed all the way back into the woods where it goes, we can see here that it dead ends and is very much more heavily grown up at the end. And from looking around in there, there's a lot of large boulders and rocks and other debris and whatnot that clearly kind of says that whatever this is that we found, this railroad bed, never went further than where it has gone here, and it was never extended past this section because if it had been, those things would have had to have been moved out of the way to allow passage, from a train or car or truck or whatever to get further back. So that clearly was never done. And if we look at the aerial photography here, we can see that, back here further, we keep looking, it kind of looks like it, again, dead ends. It doesn't really go anywhere. And if we explore out a little bit, we can see that actually over this hill is now currently a house has been built, a road's been built. So it's, definitely not part of any old structure or anything like that. So as I began to ask myself, what could this, railroad bed have been for? When was it originally used? What was it for? I began to, kind of wonder, what is it? Why is it here? What was it originally used for? And living in the area, I know that Hiram was originally founded, and one of the biggest industries that it was well known for at the time of the founding of Hiram was cotton. But there was a nearby cotton gin right in this area that was well known for producing cotton and being loaded on the train as part of the railroad service to this area. So, growing up in the area, whenever I was young in the early 1990s, there was a restaurant not far from here, up the road a little ways, known as the Cotton Gin. And that's kind of what I always thought was the original Cotton Gin, was the restaurant that it was known as the Cotton Gin, because it was well decorated up to be a cotton gin. The Cotton Gin restaurant was built in a shopping plaza called Cotton Plaza. But for a number of years from the 2000s on, that shopping center had been basically abandoned. It had been kind of blocked off from the road. Gates were put in to kind of keep people out, and the property kind of just fell into dereliction and was abandoned. In fact, in 2013, I actually went down there and explored the remains of the restaurant and of that area. And during that time, I actually did find the original restaurant basically looked exactly like I remembered it looking from whenever I was a young kid. It was just kind of boarded up and abandoned, but it was still kind of the same. And what I also found was this pond area back in the woods, deep, far back away from the restaurant. And it also had this big, giant water wheel. And I went down there and explored that at the time and kind of asked myself, could this be the original foundation for the water wheel for the cotton gin? And I looked at it and I thought about it and I thought, yeah, maybe it's possible it could have been. But then again, maybe it's just a recreation. It's just something for the restaurant. Maybe this isn't really the spot of the mill. But actually, come to find out, today the Cotton Gin has been reopened. It is now a wedding venue here in the area. And part of all of that, I found an article that says, yes, the Cotton Gin is indeed the original spot of the Cotton Gin from back in the day. So if we look at the aerial photography here, we can see that the Cotton Gin sits way south of the downtown Hiram area. So this railroad bed spur, which is located up here, we can kind of see that no, more than likely not, the spur had nothing to do with the cotton gin directly. It's not like it was a spur that went down to the cotton gin so they could load the cars directly with cotton from the gin. Nope. Instead, the cotton had to be probably put on buggies and hauled by mule or ox or horse or whatever to downtown and then loaded on the cars there. So this railroad spur, while it may and probably did hold the cars for the cotton gin and everything else that came into Hiram. It was not originally ran to be part of the actual cotton gin complex. So what is this spur? Why is it here? Why is it abandoned? What did it used to be? What is it? So that brought me to the next part of this video. And now we discuss a little bit more on the history of Hiram and the railroad coming to Hiram. And that takes us to the depot, or what used to be the Hiram Rail Station that sat in Hiram between the tracks and the siding in downtown Hiram. Whenever I was a kid in the early 1990s, the old depot still sat on this spot in between the tracks and the siding in downtown Hiram. It was abandoned. It was no longer in use between the late 60s and the early 1970s. At that time, it was converted into an antique store and was later used for storage. In 1991, the depot was purchased by Mr. Leggett and his wife Gail. They wanted to move it to their property, which sat on the corner of Main and Railroad Streets. However, that move wasn't too popular with the other city residents, and so an uproar ensued, and that decision was called off. At that time, the property then sat vacant until 2005, and the depot kind of just fell in derelict from that time on until 2005. In 2005, Mr. Leggett planned to move the building from where it sat to the other side of the spur where a car dealership now sits today. However, during the attempted move, it was found that one of the walls was full of termites and the floor was no longer stable as well. So they both crumbled during part of the move, and the structure was found to be unfit to be moved and not structurally sound, and just had to be basically torn down at that point. So Mr. Leggett decided that instead of moving what was left of the structure, that he would just salvage parts from the original structure and basically rebuild a new structure that was built in the same scheme, in the same structural pattern of the original depot. And that structure was then built on what is now today the depot car lot. And some of the original light fixtures and doors and braces that were used to build that building actually came from the original depot building. And that car lot, the depot, still exists today and still serves the car lot well. And they enjoy using the depot building that is kind of historical as their building for the car depot. But what does all of that have to do with this railroad spur? Well, I didn't know until I found a painting of historical downtown Hiram. In this painting, we can see that most of the original buildings that still exist today in downtown Hiram are shown exactly where they used to be. And we can actually see the depot here sitting in between the main line and the spur in Hiram. But then if we look closer, what we end up seeing here is the spur has been altered. It doesn't sit as it does today, where the spur ends at the road that goes through Hiram. Actually, the spur goes through that road and then goes to a switch on the other side of the road and rejoins the main line. And that is the key. That is the answer. Now, this is the only piece of evidence that I can find that explains the history of this spur and the changes that were made to its original foundational running from the days of Hiram having a train and a depot and not having a train and a depot anymore. Sometime after the 1960s and 1970s, this rail formation that is shown here in the picture was altered to its current day setup, where the switch is now down far away from the road crossing, coming up from the south section of the spur line instead of the north section over here on the other side of Hiram. And because of that, back in the day, the rail line actually went down this abandoned railroad spur that we now have found and discovered today and dead ended down there. And this long railroad spur allowed cars to be taken and pushed down from the depot and to be used to be stored to have things loaded on them, such as the cotton bales and whatnot from the city of Hiram. And then a train would come in later in the day, connect to those cars, and pull them out. And so there you have it. That is how the original railroad spur here in Hiram used to run, and that is what we have now found today as this abandoned railroad spur.